Okay, so the secretary got back on Friday. As he was flying back, Israel was beginning its retaliation, began and finished its retaliation, maybe finished its retaliation against Iran. I'm wondering what you can say, one, about that, and then two, about your efforts, such as they are, to try to get ceasefires for both Gaza and Lebanon.
Yeah, sure. On the first, so as you heard us made clear, starting on October 1st, when Iran launched its unprecedented ballistic missile attack, 200 ballistic missiles launched from Iran at the state of Israel. Israel had a right to respond to that attack. We supported their right to do so. They responded on Friday night. We believe this should be the end of the matter. As you know, because we talked about it quite publicly, we were communicating with them for nearly 4 weeks about the nature of their response and making sure that their response should be one that would be proportionate and would not in any way lead to further escalation. We believe that was the nature of the response and that Iran should not respond in any way. And that if Iran does not respond in any way, if Iran does respond in any way, we will continue to defend Israel. When it comes to the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon, so as you know, negotiators met over the weekend to discuss how we can capitalize on the opportunity presented by Yahya Sinwar's death to try to move forward negotiations and get to an end of the war. I'm not going to get into the substance of the negotiations, but as the Secretary said last week, we wanted to see whether there are new formulations, new permutations of the deals that have been on the table, to see if there's a way to break the logjam that we've been at and move forward and finally get an end to the war. And we will continue to pursue that. And then when it relates to the conflict in Lebanon, I don't have any new updates from what the Secretary said last week.
Okay. On the Iran retaliation, are you satisfied with that the Israelis listened to your advice and counsel?
We do believe that well, let me say, first of all, so you heard the president say publicly a couple of things that he thought should not be included in the response. And if you look at the response that Israel launched, it did not include nuclear-related targets or attacks on economic sites. The response from Israel was limited to military sites, which was entirely appropriate given the nature of the attack by Iran. So we do think it was a proportionate response that should not lead to further escalation by Iran, and we certainly hope that Iran will not further escalate the conflict.
Over the past week, a lot of the discussion about post-Sinwar conflict in Gaza has been about figuring out whether Hamas is serious about cutting any kind of hostage deal. Now it's been about a week and a half since Sinwar was confirmed to be dead. Is the time that has elapsed indicative that Hamas is not serious?
I think it is too early to say, to be perfectly honest. So Hamas has a process it goes through to select a new leadership. It appears to be going through that process now. We obviously don't have a great deal of insight into Hamas's internal decision-making, but based on our conversations in the region, our understanding is that Hamas is being run by a council now, and at some point will go through a process to select a new leader. And I think the results over the next few weeks will determine whether there has been a change in their posture. What we know is that the barrier we faced before his death was that Sinwar had ruled out negotiating not further on any matter. The proposal that he had submitted in July was his final offer, and he wasn't willing to negotiate any further, and he had the ability to make that decision. He was the clear leader of Hamas. Whether the new leadership will have a new position based on either their own assessments of the situation or based on the changing facts since then, we don't know. But we believe there's an opportunity to pursue a deal, and that's what we're going to try to do.
Is the State Department confident that if Hamas is either unwilling or unable to hand over the remaining hostages, that it will be able to bring this conflict to a resolution?
Look, so Israel has, I know you were with us, so you heard the Secretary speak to this. Israel has achieved a number of really critically important strategic objectives. One of them, of course, has been to thoroughly degrade Hamas's military capabilities to the point that they could no longer launch anything like the attacks that they launched a year ago. They still maintain a threat. They still can launch terrorist activities, but their military wing has been really degraded in its capacities. And then bringing Yahya Sinwar to death was another significant objective. But we absolutely need to see all of the hostages brought home. We sometimes, we talk a lot about the hostage negotiations and the path to ending the war through hostage negotiations. Hamas should just release the hostages now. They never should have taken these hostages in the first place. They continue to hold civilians hostage. There's no justification for them to do that, and they should just release them. But we will continue. But obviously, it seems an unlikely prospect given the fact they've held them for a year now. So we're going to continue to try to bring them home. That is an important strategic objective for Israel, and it is an important strategic objective for the United States. Let's not lose sight of the fact that there are 7 Americans who continue to be held by Hamas.
It is examining a legislation that would ban UNRWA that would be able to work in Israel and in East Jerusalem. What are your thoughts on that?
So we have made quite clear to the government of Israel that we are deeply concerned by this proposed legislation. The Secretary raised this in the letter that he sent with Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Defense to Minister of Defense Gallant and Minister of Strategic Affairs Dermer a little over 2 weeks ago. As he made clear in that letter, passage of this legislation could have implications under U.S. law and U.S. policy. That remains the case. Look, UNRWA plays a critical, important role in delivering humanitarian assistance to civilians that need it in Gaza. That's not the only role they play. They play an important role providing services to Palestinians in the West Bank and throughout the region as well. But they really play an irreplaceable role right now in Gaza, where they are on the front lines getting humanitarian assistance to the people they need it. There's nobody that can replace them right now in the middle of the crisis. So we continue to urge the government of Israel to pause the implementation of this legislation. We urge them not to pass it at all. And we will consider next steps based on what happens in the days ahead.
Thank you. So, an Iran and Iraq related question. Do you think holding a session in United Nations Security Council merits Iran's complaining to the UN for against Israel? And also, Iraq lodged a complaint. Do you think it's a valid complaint that Israel violated its airspace?
The complaint you said from Iraq?
First about Iran and
then about Iraq. Yeah, I meant the second part of the question. So look, when it comes to the second part of the question, it's not something I'll speak to from here. The U.S. did not participate in this attack in any way. With respect to the first part of the question, look, our ambassador to the United Nations will speak to this at the United Nations Security Council later today. I would just make very clear that it is Iran that launched 200 ballistic missiles at Israel that put civilians in danger, that was incredibly reckless, and that threatened to really escalate this conflict beyond control. Israel had a right to respond to that attack, and it did so in a way that was proportionate, and we believe that should be the end of the matter in the region before we come to you, Jamie.
On northern Gaza, Matt, I know last week it was said the Israeli government told you guys they aren't instituting the so-called general's plan, but what is the U.S. assessment of whether Israel is intentionally carrying out a policy of starvation and displacement in northern Gaza?
So I'll just say what the Secretary said. He raised this directly with the Prime Minister and other members of the Israeli government. They said to us that they are not carrying out the so-called general's plan. I will just say that they should speak to what they're carrying out. We would clearly reject any effort to create a siege, to starve civilians, to wall northern Gaza off from the rest of Gaza. We would fundamentally reject that in every way. And we've made clear to them that we want to see humanitarians humanitarian assistance make it to civilians. We want to see civilians protected. And as you know, the Secretary sent a letter to the government of Israel several weeks ago laying out a number of specific steps that we want to see them take to get humanitarian assistance to the hands of people that need it.
But the U.S. does not assess that this policy is being carried out in the North right now.
So
you do not have your own assessment.
I'm not going to make an assessment one way or the other. I'm going to tell you that the government of Israel can speak for itself about what they're trying to do. We are watching very closely. And we are making clear to them that they need to let civilians get access to humanitarian assistance.
And you said there's been some progress, but not enough. What progress have you actually seen in recent weeks, given that we have seen this catastrophic humanitarian situation only deepen?
So we have seen more trucks get in to Gaza. One day last week, there was something like 280 trucks that got into Gaza, which is obviously a significant expansion from the very low levels that we had been in September and earlier in October. We have seen some additional routes opened up for delivery of humanitarian assistance inside Gaza. We started to see them take some other steps when it comes to dealing with the humanitarian agencies. But they have not been enough. They haven't done all the things that we outlined in the letter. The Secretary had a very detailed conversation with several government of Israel officials last week about the kind of granular actions that letter calls for them to take. And he was very clear that we expect you to take these actions, and we're willing to engage in dialogue with you about how best to do that. And we have been engaging in dialogue with them about how best to do that, both through our embassy and through Lise Grande, our special representative, and we'll continue to do that. But the bottom line ultimately is results, and we need to see better results than we see today.
And then last question, do you have any specific comment on the Israeli military operations in the Kamal Adwan hospital that we saw over the weekend?
I don't. I've seen the reports. Obviously, we want to see hospitals protected, but we do continue to see, without respect to this specific hospital, because I don't have an assessment to offer, we do continue to see Hamas hiding in civilian infrastructure, which is also something that's unacceptable.
Last Friday, the Israeli targeted a compound where the journalists used to sleep in southern Lebanon, Hasbaya. It was very known that they were hosting journalists, only journalists. It was 4 a.m. in the morning, and the journalists were asleep. I asked the State Department, and I had a general response. How are you approaching that, and that you are urging the Israeli to enable free and independent press? But can you please speak? Do you support these kinds of strikes?
We do not support strikes on journalists. Absolutely not.
Okay. My second question, did you raise that with the Israeli?
So we were in Israel before Friday, so obviously we couldn't have raised with them on Wednesday, something that happened on Friday. Whether we've discussed this specific strike since then, I'll have to take back and check.
Thank you. And one more question on the talks with the Lebanese leaders, because you used to say when it comes to Gaza, for example, the onus is on Hamas or in Israel. When it comes to Lebanon, where things are stopping, who is the obstacle?
So we did have a number of important conversations with partners in the region last week over the course of the Secretary's trip. Incredibly relevant to this is the conversation he had with the Prime Minister of Lebanon on Friday, where we discussed the fact that we want to see full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And what we mean by full implementation, we don't want to go back to where we were before October 7th, and not just the year before October 7th, which is for a number of years before October 7th, where you had Hezbollah ignoring the obligations imposed on it by that Security Council resolution, obligations with which Hezbollah said it would comply, to put down its arms and withdraw north of the Litani River. So what we have been in conversation with the government of Lebanon and other partners in the region is how we can see 1701 actually enforced, and how we can see it monitored, and how we can see it enforced in a way that means Hezbollah actually does not pose a threat to civilians in northern Israel. Those are the conversations that we've been having over the course of the last week, and obviously predating the Secretary's trip as well.
Going back to the Jabalia Hospital incident,
Yeah.
Hospitals are protected under international law. Is it permissible under international law even if Hamas is using these sites to raid them, to attack them? And why wouldn't that trigger a U.S. red line where the U.S. would withdraw aid to Israel?
So I'm not able to get into the full complexities of international law from here. I'm not an attorney. But it is a simple fact of law that hospitals do, in some circumstances, lose their protected status when they are being used to launch military attacks. That's just a fact of international law that has been true for some time. It's not an assessment with regard to this operation or any other, which I obviously can't do from here. What we have made clear is that we want to see humanitarian sites protected. That includes hospitals, it includes schools, it includes other facilities. But we continue to see, as we have seen from the beginning of this conflict, Hamas embedding its fighters inside humanitarian sites, Hamas firing at Israeli soldiers from inside humanitarian sites, and that's an acceptable practice that puts the people of Gaza at risk.
And if I could follow up, is it fair to say that the U.S. election is impacting the timing of a potential ceasefire there because the parties won't necessarily know who they'll be dealing with?
I cannot speak for any other party than the United States, and I can tell you that it has no bearing at all on our focus on trying to bring an end to the war.
Just to follow up on Jabalia and this idea of the general's plan as it's reported. I mean, you said just now you're not assessing one way or the other. It's up to the Israeli government to speak to it. But you then said you're not seeing supplies go in, basically, and that is an absolutely fundamental part of this entire idea is a siege, as it's been presented. And that would make it sound like there is a siege. So you are making an assessment.
No, I'm telling you, we're not seeing food and water and medicine get into people who need it there, and we want to see that change.
And if I could follow up, I mean, I asked the Secretary this directly, and it was, I mean, part of the question was answered, and you said again you reject fundamentally that the general's plan.
Was this in Doha?
This was in Doha. Yeah. I'll try and be a bit more concise. I mean, that plan, as it's presented, clearly would involve war crimes. So the question is, again, if Israeli soldiers are being instructed to carry out any part of this plan, should they refuse?
I'm not going to get into a hypothetical. The government of Israel has said that it's not their plan. Obviously, if any soldier in Israel or any other country is instructed to carry out a war crime, they should refuse to implement it.
And I asked the question, I mean, Eren Etzian, who's the former deputy head of the National Security Council in Israel, served under 4 prime ministers, has said that they may be committing war crimes, and if they're instructed to do so, they simply must refuse in this specific case. I mean, you talk generally, but in this specific case. Again,
anyone that's instructed to carry out a war crime should refuse to do that. I think that's a fairly inarguable statement. When it comes to this specific plan, the government of Israel has said that that's not their policy, and you should take any further questions about that up with them behind you.
Going back to this proposed bill to ban UNRWA, what do you think about this whole direction of this whole Israel versus UN situation going, like Israel attacking UNIFIL in Lebanon, Israel discussing to ban UNRWA in Gaza, and also Israeli Foreign Minister multiple times criticizing UN Secretary General for asking ceasefire or uninterrupted humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza, which is repeatedly asked by US as well.
Look, I think in a number of important ways, the relationship between Israel and the United Nations is not one that's productive, and is not one that serves the citizens of Israel well. It certainly doesn't serve the Palestinian people well. And so in a number of different contexts, we have urged the government of Israel to work more cooperatively with the United Nations, particularly to work more cooperatively with the United Nations humanitarian organizations that are delivering humanitarian assistance to people inside Gaza, and we'll continue to make that clear to them that ought to be the case.
I don't know, is that something that you would confirm to us, but U.S. ambassador to Israel, there were reports about that he was being in touch with Israeli opposition leaders about this legislation not to move forward, so that Israeli MPs who were actually backing that bill kind of felt under pressure by so-called U.S. interference.
So I'm not going to speak to particular conversations with the government of Israel, but we've made quite clear in a letter from the Secretary, from himself, and from this podium that we are opposed to the implementation of that legislation, and that there could be consequences under U.S. law and U.S. policy for the implementation of that legislation. So I don't think we could have been any more clear about our position when it comes to this bill.
Thank you.
Iraqi airspace is protected by the United States. So while Iraq is filing an official letter of complaint to the United Nations Security Council for breaching its airspace, do you take Iraq's concern into consideration?
So first of all, I'd say that's not an accurate representation of the system. Iraq is a sovereign country. It controls its own airspace. The United States does not control Iraqi airspace. The U.S. Strategic Framework Agreement outlines our bilateral relationship with the government of Iraq, and it does not address any questions of airspace, which are left to the government of Iraq to determine.
And lastly, did your force in Iraq and Kurdistan region have any role, whether for logistics or for consultation?
The U.S. did not participate in this attack.
Last question on UNRWA. I'm just trying to gain some clarity. The Biden administration, when it learned of the allegations against the UNRWA staffers, cut off funding. It never resumed it. It may have, you can maybe clarify that, but it never did. Then Congress, by huge bipartisan margin, cut off funding through at least March of next year. So you have two branches of the U.S. government who determined that UNRWA was not credible enough, trustworthy enough to continue to receive funding because of the allegations against it. How do you now pressure the Israeli government to facilitate UNRWA's work when the U.S. government in two branches doesn't really trust it?
That's not exactly what we determined. We determined that we needed to suspend funding while an investigation was underway to look into those allegations. And while that investigation was ongoing, Congress acted to block further funding. You have seen us in recent months come forward and say, we want to see that ban on funding be lifted. And we want the ability to continue to fund UNRWA precisely because of the important work it does. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't important reforms that UNRWA needs to undertake. We believe there are. We believe that the government of Israel should supply UNRWA with the information it alleges to hold against UNRWA employees. We've seen UNRWA launch investigations under its own regard to look at allegations against employees and gather information. But as far as we're aware, to this date, the government of Israel hasn't supplied any evidence to UNRWA, which they should. If they have allegations and they want UNRWA to take action, they should supply the evidence. I think that's a fairly obvious thing to do. If they want UNRWA to take action in the way that any organization should take action if any of its employees are involved in a terrorist attack. All that to be said, there is an important role that UNRWA plays that no one else on the ground can play right now. And if UNRWA goes away, you will see civilians, including children, including babies, not be able to get access to food and water and medicine that they need to live. And we find that, frankly, unacceptable. Rabia.
Just a quick question on Lebanon. Israeli airstrikes today hit historic city of Tyre in southern Lebanon with footage of it going viral. Have you seen the video? And I wondered if you have any reaction. I
have only seen the video. I can't offer any type of assessment on it. I don't know any of the underlying circumstances.
Have you seen the destruction? I mean, is that acceptable for you?
So I can't speak to the underlying circumstances of that attack, what it is that they were targeting. I'm happy to, as we get more information over the coming days, speak to it, but I'm not in the position to do so today.
Do you have any specific comment on the Israeli military operations in the Kamal Adwan hospital that we saw over the weekend?
I don't. I've seen the reports. Obviously, we want to see hospitals protected, but we do continue to see, without respect to this specific hospital, because I don't have an assessment to offer, we do continue to see Hamas hiding in civilian infrastructure, which is also something that's unacceptable.
You don't want to make an assessment either way. Like, how long will it take you, or when will you be able to make an assessment on this operation in northern Gaza? It's been going on for about 3 weeks now. There's reports of 100,000 civilians marooned in these in a few small areas, supplies unable to get in. I'm not sure if they can get out, but a lot of people probably don't want to leave their homes because they're worried about not being able to go back in. So what do you need to see to be able to say one way or the other whether the U.S. supports the conduct of this operation?
No, well, I will tell you quite clearly, right now what we're seeing is humanitarian assistance not getting in to the people in Jabalia who need it, and we don't accept that. So if you ask about what we see on the ground, that's one of our assessments, is that the food and water and medicine that needs to get people in Jabalia, they aren't getting it right now, and we want to see that change.
Right, and that means, based on what's in the letter, one of the key points of the letter from a few weeks ago is to end the isolation of northern Gaza, right? So what you seem to be saying right now is, as of now, which is, we're a couple of weeks into a 30-day deadline, Israel is not meeting the U.S. conditions that were set out in that letter?
So without getting into any one of the conditions, obviously at this point they're not meeting all of the conditions of the letter. We made clear there were some things that needed change immediately, other things that would take more time. They have not fully implemented all of the changes that we called for in that letter, and we're going to wait until before we offer a final assessment, we're going to wait till the expiration of the 30 days. It's obviously fair to do that, but we want to see them continue to make changes along the way.
And I know you've been asked this before, but so if it does turn out that they haven't met these conditions, which it's not just this kind of passive element of there being bureaucratic hurdles, aid not getting in. This is an active operation that's taking place that's causing the conditions that you're talking about. What is the leverage here? What is the threat?
So the letter mentioned that there are various U.S. laws and policies that are implicated by a failure to allow humanitarian assistance to get people who need it, and I think I'll leave it at that.